welcome to I-24 News Defense, your weekly look into security, intelligence, and strategic affairs. In this edition, the American plan to put 50 U.S. commandos on the ground in Syria. Is there a new strategy, and what can it achieve in this high-stakes civil war? And 20 years after the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, a look at how the IDF reacts to Palestinian uprisings in his day and now. We begin tonight with the American decision to put boots on the ground in Syria, just weeks after the administration canceled a failed program to train and arm Syrian rebels. The U.S. has since defended the plan, calling it a way to fight the Islamic State, but not to get involved in the civil war itself. What are U.S. troops going to do inside Syria? Jim Avila of ABC News has more from the White House.
There are no American troops in Syria, but within several weeks, the first U.S. Special Forces will start flowing behind the front lines in what the White House says is a training mission and not a combat mission.
They're being deployed to Syria with a train, advising, and assist mission. And that is not an effort to downplay the serious risk that they're facing.
National security forces tell me the troops, less than 50, will, however, accompany opposition forces on dangerous missions, such as hostage rescue. And while they will not routinely be on the front lines, they will defend themselves. Why are they going now? Sources tell ABC News American special forces will be used to enable local militias to take and ultimately hold the ISIS stronghold of Raqqa, secure the border between Syria and Turkey, and degrade the ISIS supply lines in Syria and Iraq.
The president does expect that they can have an impact in intensifying our strategy.
And with me in the studio is Dr. Jonathan Spire, Director of the Rubin Center for Research in International Affairs. Dr. Spire, thanks very much for being with me.
Good evening.
So this U.S. decision coming just weeks after the administration canceled another program to train Syrian rebels. What, in your perspective, can some 50 U.S. Special Forces achieve in this chaos of Syria?
Well, there is a certain logic to this current project which was not there in the previous train and equip program. And the logic is that this time the United States is allying with existing forces on the ground that have proved themselves. These 50 guys are not going in to be by themselves. They're going to link up with a thing that the United States calls the Syrian Democratic Forces. But what that really is it's the Kurdish YPG militia with a couple of very small Arab militias added onto it. Now, the Kurdish YPG militia has partnered successfully with U.S. air power all the way going back to last October when they fought in Kobani together and then cleared ISIS out of much of northeast Syria. So what this new project basically represents is it's America beginning now to work with existing proven forces on the ground. That's a much more logical template, so to speak, than trying to build up a force from scratch, what the previous project was about.
Those forces are already involved in an offensive at the moment, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct. They've begun already to push toward east of Hasaka city in Hasaka province, which is close to Raqqa province, where, of course, the heartland of Islamic State and its capital city lies. So, yes, there's been some movement already. They're clashing with IS on a daily basis. There's reports today, by the way, of a large IS car bomb which hit a YPG convoy east of Hasaka city. So the fighting is daily and ongoing, yes.
If we're talking about the United States' assertion that this is going to target the Islamic State, that is the goal, and not to get involved in the Syrian civil war, does that seem like a realistic goal, to target that group but stay out of the war as a whole?
Well, it's a goal which the U.S. has been clear on since the start of this coalition action against ISIS, of course. Again, to some degree, by relying on Kurdish rebels, the YPG, who are much less, in any case, hostile to the Assad regime, but who see their main adversary as ISIS, fighting over the same ground in a certain sense in the far northeast of Syria. That gives a greater chance of this to attain a certain amount of clarity. The problem before was that the Arab rebels that the U.S. wanted to work with were mainly interested in fighting against Assad, and America wanted them to fight against ISIS. But by partnering with this different group, this group of Kurdish rebels who mainly are concerned with ISIS, again, you know, success isn't guaranteed by any means, but there is a certain amount of coherence to this, I would say, although I don't want to sort of be too quick to apportion praise, of course,
to be too optimistic.
To be too optimistic. With a certain amount of coherence that wasn't there before.
At the same time, we do hear from British Parliament lawmakers asking to hold off on Cameron's request for further airstrikes in Syria until there is a strategy strategy. So from hearing them, it sounds like they're not satisfied with this plan.
Yeah, well, the British are very concerned with regard to the possibility, of course, of taking action in the skies over Syria. I think largely because of the Russian involvement over Syrian skies right now and the very, worrying possibility of clashes. I think also the British issue is to do with a certain amount of parliamentary arithmetic. The British opposition leader, fresh opposition leader Jeremy Corbyn, is very, very hostile to any possibility of British planes being used over Syria, which means the opposition party was against Cameron. There were elements within his own party that were against him too, so he wouldn't, it appears, have been able to pass such a vote through Parliament.
Very volatile mix of forces.
Well,
Dr. Jonathan Spire, thanks very much for this.
Thanks.
And moving on, Israel is marking 20 years since the assassination of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, amid yet another wave of terror and with the term Intifada once again in the air. And despite Rabin's reputation linked with peace, he was also long known as Mr. Security, which came to light with his iron fist in dealing with the First Intifada. Correspondent Shai Ben-Ari looks back.
The conquest of the old city of Jerusalem, including the Jewish quarter and the Western Wall. Iconic images featuring a 45-year-old Yitzhak Rabin. IDF chief of staff at the time, Rabin was one of the architects of the Six-Day War victory, which also saw Israel capture the West Bank, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights from Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, respectively. This footage became etched into the collective consciousness of the Jewish state, transforming Rabin into a legendary figure associated with Israeli military might. Rabin's reputation as Mr. Security also earned him the respect of the Israeli right wing, and after a 3-year term as prime minister in the 1970s, he served 6 years as defense minister in the 80s under both Labour and Likud prime ministers. His credibility offered him the leeway to make controversial decisions. In 1985, Rabin forged the so-called Jibril deal, which saw the exchange of 1,150 security prisoners for 3 Israeli hostages captured during the First Lebanon War. Among those released were terrorists responsible for the murder of dozens of Israelis. Years later, this decision was criticized by many on both the left and right, and seen as a prelude to the first Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, which took place in the West Bank and Gaza, both under Israeli control at the time. By 1987, with the Intifada in full swing, Rabin ordered a crackdown, which included mass arrests, closures of Palestinian towns and villages, and home demolitions. An infamous quote attributed to Rabin from this period calls for arms and legs to be broken.
Those who are engaged in these terror activities will be eliminated.
In 1992, Rabin again led Labour to an election victory, this time vowing to restart a stalled peace process. In December of that year came another controversial decision, the expulsion of 415 members of Hamas and Islamic Jihad to Lebanon, a move which triggered protest from the Israeli left and the international community.
I and the government took the decision, those Islamic fundamentalistic murders and the movement that supported with the purpose to murder Israelis.
Many of those expelled built ties to Hezbollah and its Iranian masters during their time in Lebanon. Most eventually returned to Gaza and the West Bank, among them Mahmoud al-Zahar and Ismail Haniyeh, who became Hamas leaders. Others would carry out terror attacks that helped derail the Oslo process. Rabin, who famously referred to himself as a soldier in the Army of Peace, eventually paid the ultimate price, his life, in an attempt to forge Israeli-Palestinian peace.
Joining me now is Gilad Sher, who served under Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in the 94-95 interim agreement negotiations with the Palestinians, and as Chief of Staff to former Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ehud Barak. He now heads the Center for Applied Negotiations. Mr. Sher, thanks very much for being with me.
Thank you.
You were in policy positions in the Israeli government from the First Intifada to the Second Intifada. How would you compare, if it's possible to do so at all, how the defense establishment dealt back then versus today?
I don't think that there is a comparison that would be justified for making the case on the first, the second, and the so-called upcoming Third Intifada. The first one was mainly demonstrations, cold weapons, and Molotov cocktails before it became more, I would say, problematic for us in terms of the defense establishment. It has been accommodated just slowly, but it has been accommodated and addressed by the security establishment quite well. after a couple of months of adjustments of the counter weapons, etc., and the countermeasures. The Second Intifada was, we were much more prepared. We knew that it would be coming when we reached the closing phase of negotiations, and we knew that Arafat will try to help a kind of a bloodshed wave that would mark his resistance to compromises, etc. We didn't know how long it will take. We didn't know how uncontrolled it would take. It will be, but what happened is that the military, the IDF, as well as the police, were well equipped and well trained and well prepared to counter the upcoming wave of violence in Israel, within Israel, vis-a-vis the Israeli Arabs. This was much different.
Right.
There was no good preparation, and the measures taken were not good enough.
If we're looking back at the First Intifada and the period sort of leading up to Oslo and the use of force that Rabin was very much a proponent of, do you think the Israeli use of force to counteract that sort of uprising has evolved? Have lessons been learned?
I think that lessons are learned throughout this period, and the security establishment is drawing lessons from all kinds of events. I think that right now the situation is rather contained, and there's no excess in the use of force. There's no excessive measures taken, etc. This is more protecting protecting what we can protect and what we can defend. Is
that sustainable, though?
I'm not sure that it is sustainable without any political process. I believe that we need a political process. That we need to resume negotiations, or at least a dialogue with the Palestinians, as well as on the regional level. And for this, defense, military, police is not enough.
Right. Very briefly then, from what you experienced also a lot on the negotiation side through several administrations, do you think this current administration has anything to offer?
I truly hope so. I believe that the two states for two people is in the benefit of Israel, is in the benefit of the national security of Israel, and this is the way to go. This is, by the way, Rabin's directive and direction. So we need to hold the same compass towards to a nation state with a boundary between them.
Gilad Shera, we'll end that then with hope. Thanks very much for being with us tonight, and we'll continue on 20 years after the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin from the security, the protection perspective. Doron Berger Best Elon is a former head of security at the Israeli Security Agency and the founder of Asero Worldwide. He joins me now. Thanks very much for being with us.
You're welcome. Thank you, Norit.
There's an atmosphere today with a lot of extremist language, obviously, especially online, attacks coming from the far-right settler movement as well. And many say another assassination is not a matter of if, but of when. What would you advise?
Well, maybe I'll take it to the context of the Rabin assassination. The Rabin assassination happened a few days after a major event that most of us tend to forget, and that was the targeted killing of Fathi Shkaki in Volta, Malta. Actually, that was about a week before. Fathi Shkaki organization was responsible for the Bet Lid notorious attack, where we had two suicide bombers, staggering attacks, and Rabin himself, that actually visited the site right after, was shocked. Everybody was shocked because of the brutality of this particular event that was, although in atmosphere of suicide attacks, still it was a big issue. Several months later, Fathi Shkaki was killed in Malta. Israel never claimed responsibility for that, but the fact is that it happened on, I believe, October 27th. In other words, the concern should have been there on early November, the concern that Fathi Shkaki organization and others will retaliate against Israel that was blamed for that action was certainly a concern. The fact that the security failed, and the fact that the preparation, the planning and the preparation and the execution of the security plan during the event was so miserable, tells you a lot. In other words, you should here put things in context and mostly plan and execute correctly. I think this is the major failure, and this is the thing that my professional colleagues need to adopt all over, and this is what we try to do to help our clients with.
So context is important. Thanks very much for this.
Thank you. You're welcome.
And that's it for us for tonight. Join us here in the studio next week for another edition of I-24 News Defense. Until then, we'll leave you with some images of a soldier's perspective. Have a great night.